When looking for the king of podcasts, you're at the wrong channel.
Well, excuse me!
Looking for good ideas for life? You're far from good hands.
Hey, bud, what's your problem?
If you think the listener is always right, you're far from the right place.
Out of order! Even in the future, nothing works!
Hosted by a Northeasterner by birth, but a rebel by choice.
Are you threatening me?
If you want a host that floats between love and madness,
and we know the night is always gonna be here anyway. Thinking of you's working up my appetite, looking forward to a little afternoon delight.
then play on and listen to Crazy Train Radio.
All right, guys, listen to some blues riff and B. Watch me for the changes and try and keep up, okay?
Within the gaming world, there are your general gamers, but then there are those that enjoy the dark underbelly of gaming. If you're one of those that enjoy the dark underbelly of gaming, we certainly got the place to send you. Scorpion Lair Games. That's right, Scorpion Lair Games is the creators of the true crime hit Killers, the card game. Let's not forget they also have Killers Clothing Company, their profiler game, and things like the 5-Minute Murder channel on YouTube. And we certainly can't forget the new book that is certainly a hit, Beyond the Headliners, True Crimes, Myths, and Legends. Make sure you visit Jeff and the Scorpion Lair Games on Facebook and everywhere today.
Hey everyone, I'm George Schire. I want you to know I do a lot of podcasts. I love doing podcasts. And I've got a new one that I love doing, and I want you to listen to it. Crazy Train Radio. Another one of the best. You'll enjoy.
Hey folks, it's your least favorite host in the podcast world, Croc, Jonathan Steele. And boy, do we have a good one for you today.
Alright folks, not going to go into my full spiel, but this is going to be a back and forth conversation with this gentleman. Again, the previous two we done solo have gone over 2 hours. So this is just going to be one of those wait and see how it goes. But which is scary. This next guest said, I'll let you lead, I follow, which is quite scary. But he also runs the Wrestling Time Machine. He's a historian and author. Mr. George Schire, how are you, sir?
Absolutely great. And when you say that we went a couple hours, that's not unusual because I love talking wrestling. And as you know, sometimes they take us to other little topics along the way too, but that's life, you know?
Yep.
So.
And the previous two episodes, like the first one, excuse me, we broke down like your growing up, getting into the business, etc. Started with the AWA stuff, and second part, we did a lot of AWA and talent and stuff that we didn't cover on the first one. So, and there'll be some AWA questions along the way for me, as usual, stuff we didn't touch on. But we're going to talk the business in general. And I think Matt, who is sitting in the wings again, because I'm trying to teach the kid, how dare I? But we might even touch on some things that, I'll start there. What the hell? Because I know Matt is a comic guy, but also a movie guy. But I'll start with this, George, because I know you grew up collecting comics and stuff for a certain time period. Are you a Batman guy or a Superman guy?
When push comes to shove, I always pick Batman.
Why is that? And I'm pushing.
Well, my original rationale was when I found superhero comics in right now about 62 years ago when I found them. I found Batman by accident. I'm sure you're familiar with the old Adventures of Superman TV show.
Yes.
From the 50s. And of course, that was playing reruns in the 60s on TV yet. It still is, in fact. It's pretty much on all the time.
Like Me TV and things like that, right?
Yeah, yeah. But anyway, I was a Superman fan. And I had went over to the drugstore, and I'd have been about 12 years old. I went over to the drugstore, and they used to have those cases that had the comics lined up in them, and you turn the stand and you get all the latest comics. Well, I found Superman, and to that point in time, I had never seen a Superman comic. So I bought that particular issue, and right next to it, there was a comic called World's Finest Comics. And I looked at it, and Superman was on the cover, and lo and behold, this character Batman was on the cover. And it was labeled as your two favorite superheroes in one adventure together, Superman and Batman. So I coerced my dad into another 12 cents, because they were 12 cents a comic back then. And I said, Dad, can I get these two comics? And almost by accident again, I looked a little farther down on that same rack, and there was an individual issue of Batman. And so my dad gave me a total of 36 cents. He gave me 2 quarters and gives me 36 cents so that I could buy these 3 comics. And when I read the Batman, I immediately liked it because he didn't have superpowers. He was a normal guy who had built his body up and keened his senses so that he could fight crime. And then I learned later the background for his storyline, that his parents had been killed as a little boy. He witnessed it, and he vowed that he was going to avenge their deaths, and so on. And so I always liked Batman because I guess he could be hurt, or he wasn't invulnerable and had every imaginable power like Superman and then all the other superheroes. And that's really how it happened. So Batman has always been my favorite, but along with Superman. And then I loved Marvel's Daredevil. That was another one that just intrigued me. The fact, are you familiar with Daredevil, that he was blind?
Very slightly. I'm not much. Matt, jump in here. You know the comics better than I.
I've watched bits and pieces of the Netflix Daredevil, and I've seen, of course, the Ben Affleck film.
Okay. Well, the Ben Affleck film was really good, I thought. But, in the 60s when Daredevil was introduced by Stan Lee of the Marvel Group, it was fun because he had been blinded as a kid. But when he was blinded, for some reason, all of his other senses were enhanced, and he could actually see better or hear better than anybody else. And then, of course, he's flying around doing this stuff as a blind guy. And that was kind of like a Batman in its own way. So those were kind of my 3 favorites. But I had many over the years. It's like wrestling. You found programs here and programs there, and you liked them all, so you had them all.
I couldn't agree more with you about what you said about Superman. Superman, to me, it's just it's annoying that he's so powerful. It's like, even when you watch like the Justice League movie, it's like if every single one of the other Justice League members were present, they're not even as powerful as if just Superman was there. That to me is just kind of, it's not appealing. You like a superhero with vulnerabilities, human nature.
Well,
I
and you
agree.
know, the thing about the Superman character, I mean, obviously since 1938 when he was created, you know, he has evolved for each generation with different powers and abilities beyond those of mortal men. You know the story, how it goes. But the thing with Superman, if you go back to 1970, DC Comics actually made Superman less super for a while. They had gotten away. It was the issue that came out was called Superman Nevermore, and they had on the cover he was breaking out of chains that were green kryptonite. That was the whole object of the story. And what had happened was they created a storyline where all the kryptonite on Earth had been through some atomic explosion that had taken place, that all kryptonite that had allegedly fallen to Earth over the decades was now just a normal metal. It no longer harmed Superman. And he became much more, because he was now a little bit, well, he was actually more powerful, but they gave him, with this atomic explosion, there was oh boy, if I think about the comic, it was some sort of a cosmic being that was draining his power. You'd have to look up the story, that Superman Nevermore from 1970. But they had made him, they had actually given him some, vulnerability.
Vulnerabilities, yeah.
Yeah, and the thing that I thought was interesting about Superman was that you had all these superheroes, and if you looked at them in their superhero uniforms, they were all built like superstar Billy Graham, the wrestler, muscles on top of muscles, and it was logical. You accepted it. You know, Batman should have built himself up to be this way. But it always bothered me that Superman had this out-of-the-world build too, because Superman gained his powers simply by coming to Earth, and he was super under Earth's yellow sun. That was the storyline. So he didn't have to have bulging muscles to be invulnerable or have X-ray vision or all of the other many powers he had. So he could have been a normal skinny kid, and he'd have still had those powers. And that was what always, but I understand, to be Superman, you have to, you paint the illusion too. So that's where it came.
Looked apart.
But as a kid, I had that figured out that, I could have been Superman. My scrawny little 12-year-old body, I could have been Superboy if I had come from Krypton. That's the way it worked, because I'd have powers.
Right on. I agree. All right, before we get into the wrestling side of things, final
we got to go to wrestling?
Oh, yeah, I know. We're going to make it difficult, like we're debating politics or something. But no.
We don't want to do that.
Well, that's a whole nother case and a whole nother show, not us. Because I'd be like banging my head against this bookcase, but yeah. As far as there's a ton there. But with Batman, obviously you mentioned some of the movies and stuff and whatnot. Between the TV show, and I'm referencing the 60s show with Adam West, but also the movies that became popular from Michael Keaton on, when they really started becoming movies. Overall, who was your favorite Batman, since he's your guy?
Well, I have to be honest with you on that too. I think I saw only the first two Batman movies, and I think Michael Keaton was in the first one, correct?
He was in the first two.
He was in the first two. Then I've seen those two, and then Val Kilmer, wasn't he Batman too?
Matt, where was he at?
Yes, sir, he was.
Val Kilmer was,
okay. In Batman and Robin from 1997, I believe.
Okay,
yes.
Those are the two that I saw play Batman. And it was, both of those episodes or those movies, they had, altered the storyline for Batman a little bit again, for, again, a new generation of fans.
Right.
I will tell you this, that obviously there is absolutely 180 degrees difference between the Adam West Batman of the 60s and the Keaton or Val Kilmer Batmans. But you've got to remember that, again, it was different generations. And what
Yes.
happened with DC Comics when they put Batman on TV in 1966, about 2 years earlier, so that takes us to 64, Batman had attained what they called the new look. And that was when Batman had the oval put on his chest, the yellow oval with the bat in it.
Yes.
Before that, all the years Batman only had a black bat on his gray uniform. So in 64, he was kind of revamped. They had actually killed off Alfred in the comic books. Alfred had risked his life in 1960. I think it was early 65. I still have all the comics, but he had risked his life to save Batman and Robin. He was crushed by a big bulldozer of rocks and he died. And that started the new look. So there was a new change in Wayne Manor, Bruce Wayne Manor. Well, that's when they brought in the comic books, they brought in Aunt Harriet. And believe it or not, back in 1965, when Aunt Harriet was brought in, and she was supposedly Dick Grayson's aunt, and she came in to take care of Dick and Bruce because these two guys needed to have, Alfred was killed and they needed to have someone to take care of him. It was written up, though, that originally she was brought in because believe it or not, even back then it started that it's two guys living together, funny things could be going on. It was throwing in the gay aspect that they could be gay. And so they brought in, and this is really what they had stated. They had brought in Aunt Harriet to kind of solve that little quarry. So now we flash forward to Batman coming on TV. Well, interestingly enough, when they filmed the Batman TV show, Alfred was included in it. And you will remember that Aunt Harriet was as well. So then the comics, after about a year and a half of Alfred being dead, through comics, only this could happen. It was found that he really wasn't killed and he had been in suspended animation and he became one of Batman's enemies called the Outsider for a year unknowingly. And he was trying to hurt Batman, but then he was saved and he come back and Alfred was with him again. So that's how Aunt Harriet came into the fold. And they put Alfred in the show and they had no choice then but to come back with the comic books.
Right on. All right. So I'd like to give full disclosure. What's that, Matt? I'm sorry.
I was just saying that's very interesting stuff. I wish that they would have made these plots in the film. And also, I have to correct myself. Val Kilmer was in Batman Forever, not Batman and Robin. That was Clooney in Batman and Robin.
Yeah, that's right. George Clooney did do it, right? Yeah.
Right.
And and I may have seen that one when you said George Clooney. I may have. And I do remember the Batman Forever.
Right on.
Yes.
And that's all good, Matt, that you corrected yourself. It is what it is.
Right.
All right. So I want to give full disclosure, as I was starting to say, with this. And this would have been before our panel that we taped and will be out over the weekend, because it's a nice little nugget to clean up and make sure everything sounds pretty, even though there won't be much to take out. So, like I said in the introduction, we did the two, sessions talking strictly wrestling with George. And I'm very critical of myself, George. And I think a lot of creative types are. But I was very happy with those episodes, how they turned out. Just with the conversations and everything was great. And I believe we got connected because of Brian Young, correct?
I believe so.
Yeah, I have to think about that.
Let me interject something to
Go
you
ahead.
too. One of the things when you complimented yourself there, and I do tend to agree with you. I learned, you heard some of my growing up years and some of the things that I had shared previously. One of the things that I will tell you that I have become proud of is that I can pretty much have a conversation with any person about pretty much any topic. I don't claim to be an authority on everything, only on wrestling, but I don't claim to be an authority, but I have learned that I can have a conversation. Some of it can be opinion. Sometimes we can toss facts in, but I'm proud of that fact because if I get with a group of people or one person one-on-one, I can always have a conversation. I'm just one of those people. And that's something I had to make myself do because there was a time when I would have shunned away from any one-on-one conversations, much less being in a group or anything like that. So I say that only because when we do these things, I'm never afraid of what the topic is. If I don't know about it, I'll tell you, but I can have a conversation.
Right on. So anyway, phone rings one morning a couple weeks ago, and I look at because I got this great concept called caller ID, but it was from Facebook Messenger, and it was George Schire. Right away, I'm gonna pick up because I obviously have love and respect for George since I've known you a couple years now. George, what's going on? And he goes, and I saw the post afterwards, what you were talking about. So George says to me, he goes, hey, listen, I went back and was going through some material and came across our previous episodes, and I really enjoyed our conversation. I said, well, I did too, George. He goes, I think we're good for round 3. Something says we can go. And as soon as he said that, George, you're absolutely right. Like it wasn't it wasn't one of those. As soon as he said, George, you're absolutely right. When can we do this? We looked at the calendar. Here we are. So let it be written. So George, let's get into the wrestling a little bit here. And there's so many different angles we can go with and stuff we didn't talk about. But I'm thinking about the territory days that you grew up on. You obviously, the AWA was your home base, etc. And the thing about the territories, and Matt wouldn't know exactly about them because of his age, maybe heard of them, etc., etc. But people younger than me wouldn't exactly know about it unless you research it. But George, you're one of many that had an opportunity to see guys come and go, different gimmicks, sometimes being a baby, they might come back as a heel, just so many different, you can mix things up. Guys will come in for 6 months to a year, go away, come back in a different presentation, like I said, either a baby or a heel, etc., new gimmick, whatever. Was that good for guys like you growing up?
Well, I would say it was good for me. But I wasn't the average type of wrestling fan. The majority of the wrestling fans, Jonathan, were kids, guys, people, adults, whatever. They would watch their local wrestling program. They might like a certain wrestler that was in the territory at the time. Somehow that wrestler caught on with them, or the program that wrestler was in. Like say they saw Crusher and Mad Dog going at it, it grabbed them, and they would go to the matches. But the thing about wrestling was that for me in the Twin Cities, Minneapolis, St. Paul, back in the 60s, wrestling was running twice a week. They were wrestling live or running live cards. For the average person, going to anything twice a week and being religious about it is sometimes difficult because you've got your life going on around you. So I wasn't the normal fan. Really what happened though, for me, it worked because when I got my license and my driver's license, and I was thinking about this.
16 years old, I remember.
I was 16 years old, And so I was thinking about this just the other day again. That's back in 1967. And I wasn't really excited about getting my driver's license. But what made me excited to get it was that I realized that I would no longer have to rely on my dad to take me to a wrestling card. My dad really wasn't a fan. And when he did, God bless him, when he did take me, he did it because I'm assuming he knew I totally enjoyed it. But I couldn't get to all of them I wanted to. So that's where the license came in, that now on Saturday nights, if there was a live card in Minneapolis, I was going. And if there was a live card in St. Paul on Thursday night, I was going. But not every fan was like that. And even from a monetary standpoint, I mean, you can look at wrestling programs and say, well, geez, a ticket only cost $3 in those days. Well, in those days, $3 was expensive as a $30 ticket is today, or a $40 ticket is to something.
It's all need relative. To put the time period in the perspective with that.
Right. And so, if you're going to pop $3 all the time for a ticket, there you go. But so that's really how it worked. It's the territories for me were different too, because a lot of people who watched wrestling, I always found this sad. I'd go sit at the wrestling card and somebody would buy a program. And at the end of the evening, I'd find the program wrinkled up on the floor under their chair, and they'd spilled their Pepsi on it or their beer, or had popcorn sprinkled all over it. And, it was dirty because there was a big old footprint in it. Mm-hmm. And they weren't a fan in the respect that program was something that they could take home, and that would be a memory piece because they were there. And, a year from now, they wouldn't be able to tell you what day they went to the card and if they'd even went to that particular card, because they had nothing to show for it. I was different. I bought a program, and
you bought multiple programs.
I did. But I mean, what I'm saying is I bought a program because I wanted a memory from that card. It just became, it helped me to follow the storylines.
Yeah.
Our programs back then were kind of different too, because even though they were written in the kayfabe vein, they weren't telling you anything that they didn't want you to know, but they were written so that you knew why the Crusher wanted revenge on Mad Dog Vachon. They'd give you the background to why they were feuding and what's going to happen. They're going to get revenge in this match. Crusher challenges him to a saloon match. Well, what the heck is a saloon match? Well, it's the Crusher. We're on, there's no holds barred, and I can knock the bum out if I want to, with a beer bottle. I mean, that's the way they would put it forth. So the programs actually gave you the reason you were sitting there that night. And then, we had those wrestling magazines in the drugstores. And I say drugstores in those days because that's where the newsstands were.
Yeah.
And when we mentioned comic books, from 1963, 4 on, every Tuesday and every Thursday, those were the days that the comic books and the wrestling, all magazines, and my wrestling magazines were delivered to the local newsstands. So once a month, the wrestling magazines would come out if they were a monthly magazine. And then, of course, the comic books, they would tell you when the next issue was on sale in the issue you're now reading. Next month, this, and it's on sale, folks, July 12th. And that would always be, all those dates would always be on a Tuesday or a Thursday back then. So that's the days they were delivered. So I would be at the drugstore on Tuesday mornings and Thursday mornings, or at least after school, if it was, during the school year. And I would be getting as pristine a copy of those comics as I could get. And certainly the Wrestling Review or the Wrestling World magazine, Ring Wrestling back then. And every once in a while, there was kind of a foreign issue that would come out. When I say foreign, it just wasn't a normal issue that was published regularly. But so that's how I did it. Now, not everybody did that. people bought a magazine by accident and they had one, and then a year later they might have another one. So your question to me is, was it normal, the territories and stuff? I wasn't normal. Not that there weren't others out there like me, because I found later there were some, but
which I'm going to bring up.
Generally speaking, at the time I was kind of a freak of nature.
For his territory, at least. Now, the reason I said he would buy, and I said that tongue in cheek, but it was the truth, and George can expand on this, and we talked about this previously, in certain aspects, that George would become, in the magazines and different things, there would be towards that bracket in those days, where you can do pen pals and different things like that. And George would write some of these other people. And I know people in other territories like a Mike Lano and Evan Ginsberg, Dave Brzezinski. There's people from other territories, per se, that people have heard on here. But you would write folks and say, hey, can I exchange programs with you? And etc. So that's why George would buy the extra programs, because he would trade these other programs from some of the other territories on these pen pals. Am I far off on that?
No, you're absolutely right. And what the deal was too is, as the 60s, after I got my driver's license in 1968, that was the first year that the WFIA, the Wrestling Fans International Association, had their first Wrestling Fans Convention. And that was another place where if you joined that group, you had fans that were also interested in fan clubs. It was funny because, Jonathan, we didn't have, obviously, the internet or all of the resources that we do today, where you can just go, wham, Google something, and there it is in front of you. Not that it's always true, but it's there for you. Okay, I had to throw that in. But
I know where you're going with that, George. It's good.
With the fan clubs, they were also each magazine would have a fan club column. And in Wrestling Review in those days, it was the guy named Don Wilson, who was the one that founded the Wrestling Fans International Association, the WFIA. And what was happening in those days is that when a wrestler would come into a territory, there would be, inevitably, there'd be a fan that, oh my God, I'm madly in love with Ray Stevens. I love Ray Stevens as a wrestler. And I'm just throwing that name out. It doesn't mean it could be any wrestler, insert any wrestler's name. And they'd get the idea that they would start this fan club for them. Most of the time, the wrestlers, in those days, you had to have a permission slip signed by the wrestler that I give George Schire permission to run a fan club for me, and the wrestler would sign it. And then to get that fan club plugged, to get it out there to the public, you would send that copy of that permission slip to a guy like Don Wilson, who was the fan club editor for Wrestling Review. And then there were other wrestling fan club columns in other magazines. You'd send them a copy of your fan club permission slip, but you also had to tell them what you were going to provide for fans to join your fan club.
Yeah.
The bottom line, as all of this worked out, is that eventually we had this network of people, of fans, that were different than that fan that I mentioned a moment ago that just went to a card here and there and left his program on the floor and went home and forgot about it until, the spirit moved him to go again. And so these fan clubs became a way for all wrestling fans to become sort of close-knit. And it also allowed us, if I joined, and back in 1968, if I would have joined a Ray Stevens fan club, and I'm trying to think of his name now. His first name was Joe. Oh heavens! He was the president of the Ray Stevens fan club. So you send your dollar dues or whatever they were back then, and then you would get a periodical bulletin from the president with some of the matches that Ray Stevens wrestled in. You might get a couple photos, but it really all brought all these fans together, because if you joined all these fan clubs, and I joined a ton of them. You know, like I say, there were only $1 to join, or $1.50. Well, then
but
the
like we were saying, that was still a big deal at the time.
Exactly. And you know, and in 1968, I'm a 17-year-old kid. I'm still going to school, got my paper route, you know, that's my money. I get my $40 a month after I deliver the papers and get paid from the paper company. And I got money for my comic books and my wrestling magazines and go to a wrestling card. I mean, I was living the life as a 17-year-old. So, but then the WFIA started having these reunions in different cities every year. And what they would do is they would go in, let's just use St. Louis, for example. They would contact the St. Louis promotions. So in this case, it would have been Sam Muchnick, etc. They'd contact them that we want to come in and hold a 2 or 3 day convention with wrestling fans, fan clubs. We'd like you to, if you were able to put on a wrestling card for us, if we'd be, you know, the night that we're going to be there. And could you have some of the wrestlers appear? That was gold, because here I am in Minnesota and I go, oh my God, I have a chance to go to St. Louis and get to see St. Louis wrestling. And then you meet fans that are, you know, they're running a fan club for Bruno Sammartino, which was Georgianne Macropolis. She was Georgianne Orsi.
God bless her.
Days. In those days, she was Georgianne Orsi. And she was also one of the fan club editors for, I believe it was Wrestling World. But you go, oh my gosh, I'm meeting Bruno Sammartino's president. So Georgianne, can we exchange programs? This is how it started. If I send you the Twin City program, would you send me your Madison Square Garden copy of your Madison Square Garden program? Sounds like a deal. So we do that. And then I would do the same to, in St. Louis, I had 3 different people over the years that I had to rely on to get me St. Louis programs. The one that became the most reliable, and God bless him, he's passed away, but it was Larry Matisic. And I'm sure you've heard Larry's name.
Yes.
But I had some fans before that were great people, had a chance to meet them. Weta Bainham was one of the ladies. And the other one was, Lillian Schnur. She was a lady that when I went to St. Louis Card, she would pick me up at the airport and make sure I had a ticket to the card when I'd visit. So she was one of the people that I traded programs with. But when I started to do this, obviously at different times I had to get a new trading partner, because the fan either, you know, died off. I don't mean died physically. I mean, they just no longer followed wrestling or whatever the case was. And then I was fortunate as I traveled around to some of these places that I would get to know the promoter of the city. So I think about Nick Roberts down in Lubbock, Texas. And Nick Roberts had been a wrestler before he became a promoter. He was a wrestler.
Was this let me cut you off for a second. Was this Nicola Roberts' father?
Yeah.
Okay.
And, yep. Nicola
Who was
Roberts,
Baby Doll, folks?
Who was Baby Doll in the wrestling business. Nick Roberts, I had contacted him. I had remembered when he wrestled for Vern Gagne in the early 60s, and Nick was in the territory as a wrestler. And I had told him that I remembered him and that I would, could I get a copy of the Lubbock program? And they ran weekly cards down around Lubbock and Amarillo and all those places. So again, it worked out. I would buy the program, get a copy, not make a copy. I'd buy a physical copy and send it off to him. And I collected Nick Roberts programs. I did the same in Houston with promoter Paul Bosch and Dave Berkowitz, Burkholz, and his first name's not Dave. Peter Burkholz. These names are coming to me as I remember this. But he would also see that I got a Houston program. And Houston ran wrestling cards every Friday night, rain or shine, unless it was Christmas Eve. which would happen about every 5 or 6 years. Christmas Eve would fall on a Friday night. And then usually in those days, they sometimes would then hold a Sunday card or something, but it would still be a weekly promotion. So I ended up so lucky to get all those programs. And I got correspondence from both Dallas and Fort Worth. I had been down there to see a card for one of the WFI reunions. And Boyd Pierce, who was their TV ring announcer and their TV wrestling host. And
that
Boyd
would have
Pierce,
been Von Erichs, right?
Yep,
Dallas.
it would have. Well, later on, it would have been the Von Erichs. This was even still when Morris Siegel was running the promotion. But Boyd Pierce was the face of the promotion, and I got to be friends with him. And Boyd was another one. Oh my gosh, if I was able to come to Dallas or Fort Worth, he would see that I had a ticket waiting for me at the wrestling card. Always got me a good seat, and then we traded programs. And he would send, and you got to remember now, in those days, Dallas ran weekly cards on Tuesday nights. Again, rain or shine, unless it was Christmas Eve. And then the same with Fort Worth. They ran Monday night cards. I believe at the time, and someone that knows this for sure you can correct me, but I think Dallas and Fort Worth were about 70 to 80 miles apart.
Mm-hmm.
So even though they used the same wrestlers, they could have a couple of different little angles going, and it was far enough apart where if somebody lived in Fort Worth, they weren't going to drive an hour and a half to go to Dallas and vice versa. So they had different audiences. But I was able,
Matt, if you can, message Latrice and see what that distance is between Dallas and Fort Worth. I'm only saying this, and sorry to interrupt, George. Yeah, we have a fan that usually joins us for different things who lives in that area. So, okay. Matt, if you can message Latrice and get that distance as we talk here.
And
George,
like I said,
what's
what
that?
did you say?
If you can, message Latrice and see Dallas and Fort Worth, what the distance
Dallas
is.
and Fort Worth.
Thank you. All right, George, go ahead.
Well, so anyway, as those networks started to be created, it really became very easy for me to know what was going on in each territory. You knew when guys came in, you knew when guys left, you knew when they were injured. And the injured wasn't always injured, it was injured for storyline purposes.
To go to
or to go, to be out of action or to have surgery or just take some time off or whatever it was. Well, I mean, we didn't know that at the time. And then there's also
that's hindsight.
Right. And then there's also the suspensions. But the thing that worked for me as a young kid and then into the 70s is that when they told us that so-and-so was injured in a territory, well, lo and behold, a few days later, I'd get a program from another territory, and guess who's on the card? Well, okay, I never had to be told that wrestling, was like this. I just figured it out on my own. Mm-hmm. Or even when the wrestler was injured, sometimes he'd show up in a different territory. And the thing that was fun about this is because we were able, or at least I was, you always learned, you go, well, that wrestler they're using down there, that looks like Frank Shields. But now he's called himself Bull Belinsky. And it was fun to try to figure that stuff out. And we did.
I remember the story you told me about Dr. X that way. So
yeah, Dr. X, and I should have remembered. I could have brought it out here. There's a picture. There was a photo of the Destroyer in one of the Wrestling Review photo albums, and they put out these albums on glossy paper. Each page was a glossy print of a full-page picture of a wrestler. Well, the Destroyer was in the one issue. And it was his familiar Destroyer pose. He had his hands out. we get Dr. X in here, and I had bought several copies of those review albums. And I took one of the pictures, and I took a black magic marker, and I colored Destroyer's white mask in and made it black with a black magic marker, covered up his nose because Dr. X had his nose covered, Destroyer didn't. I put a tunic on him, black tunic, because this is what Dr. X wore. And I drew his tights on his legs because Dr. X wore dark black tights. The Destroyer didn't. And then I looked at him and I just said, I know that's the Destroyer. I know Dr. X is the Destroyer.
Mm-hmm.
And when I had asked, or I hadn't asked, I had mentioned that very thing to Marty O'Neill, who was our announcer. Marty never confirmed or denied it, but he made the comment. He says it's odd. I'm paraphrasing here now. He said it's odd how some people don't just take the time to figure it out. Mm-hmm. Well, he didn't confirm it or deny it. He just made a comment.
He threw that out there.
And I took it as it was the fact. So
okay.
But those programs, I mean, they became the Holy Grail because that was our internet in those days. That's my internet. And then, I had mentioned to you that it became important for me because I wanted to know the results. And sometimes with the people that were sending them to me, I couldn't get Paul Bosch to write notes to me or anything. All he agreed to do was, yeah, I'll send you the program. You send me yours. That's fine. So I'm sure each Saturday morning or Monday morning after the Friday card in Houston, in the mail, he just, him or the secretary in the office or somebody put a program in the mail to me, but I had no idea what the results were. So that's when I started getting excited about, I want to find out who won these matches. Sometimes programs would put results in from the previous card in the program, but most of the time they didn't, Jonathan. And here's the reason they didn't. Because 2 weeks or 3 weeks from now, they may not want you to remember that match actually took place. Yeah. That was all part of the mystery of it. They wanted wrestling fans to be as clueless as possible. And that's the reason they got away with so many things where the fans would forget, and they let you forget.
Yeah. But some of the smartest people I know, not all of them, are wrestling fans. But I want to bring up a name that you mentioned earlier before I forget. And you mentioned Ray Stevens. And when I think of Ray, I think of two territories. I think of San Francisco, and for George Schire, and I think of Minneapolis in the AWA. Yeah. Is that the two spots that he was known for working? Because a lot of guys like from that era would float around. So were those just the two home bases he had, or did he make his name elsewhere?
Ray Stevens, when you say San Francisco was a territory in and of itself with spot shows and cities around the California area. It was run for the 60s by Roy Schire. But if you back up before 1961, when Roy became the promoter in San Francisco, Roy had been a successful wrestler himself. He used to wrestle as Professor Roy Schire. And he also teamed with Ray Stevens. He was kind of the mentor to Ray Stevens, and they wrestled as brothers. It was Roy and Ray Schire. So for several years in the later 50s, Roy and Ray Schire wrestled in Atlanta, in that territory. They wrestled in other territories as well as the Schire brothers. And obviously, when Roy went into the promotion, he took care of Ray, gave him a home. Ray became the star of San Francisco wrestling over that decade in the 60s, both as at first as just a heel beyond a heel, and then later as a babyface. And that was the thing about territorial wrestling. If you had a guy that was there for any longevity at all, it was only natural that eventually he was going to morph from a heel to a baby, or sometimes vice versa. It just because you had to come up with something new for him.
Yeah.
And it goes with storylines. So that's how it worked. And then the other part of your question, when the late 60s came around and Roy Schire was kind of falling on hard times in California, that's when Ray came to Vern and pretty much spent the 70s working the AWA, but he also still worked Texas. Ray still did go back to California, and Ray still wrestled in Florida. So his entire career, Ray started wrestling when he was 16 years old. I mean, and most of the people at the time didn't know he was that young. But he was just a hell of a probably one of the best workers ever in the business.
Thank you for that. And by the way, Matt had gotten back to me in a message. It's for what we referenced in earlier, Dallas and Fort Worth. The distance is 32 miles. So,
really? Okay.
Yeah. But I just wanted to put that out there on the episode.
Okay.
And
well,
go ahead.
I'm wrong the first time in my life.
No, that's fair.
I'm teasing.
No, I know. That's fine. Like I said, and I'm going to actually send George the kind of notes I put together here after the fact. And there's just so many places I can go. But
go there.
I want to bring something up, which I learned about with you, because I was listening to other things that you had done in other shows and stuff. Like, and I'll give them credit for this one, Bumps and Thumps, because I remember them. But there was something I didn't know about you, which makes sense, George. But it was, we're going to go back to 1969. And I don't remember the gentleman's name. I didn't put it down, so forgive me. But there was something called the Fantasy Wrestling Alliance, Hawaii and California. What was that?
Oh, okay. You made me think a second. Yep.
Okay.
All right. Yeah. How did you learn this? Before I answer the question, I know what you're talking about. How did you learn this? Did I?
Like I said, I was cruising through other shows, and you mentioned this on Bumps and Thumps.
So. Okay. Well, here's the deal. Here's what the Fantasy Wrestling Alliance was. Back in November of '68, I met Jim Melby, and Jim Melby was wrestling. He not wrestling. Jim Melby was writing for a magazine called Matt Mania. And Matt Mania went out of circulation. The guy that was running it wasn't going to be able to do it anymore. And Jim took it over, but he changed it to wrestling results. It wasn't wrestling, it was wrestling. And that was Jim Melby. The long story short is, I had subscribed to Matt Mania. I'm 17 years old now, remember this. I had subscribed to Matt Mania. I never got an issue. Several months went by. Finally, in the mail, I received a copy of something called Wrestling Results. And inside it was an explanation from this guy named Jim Melby. And Jim, I didn't know him, never heard the name before. I got this issue and I was very disappointed in the issue. It was, back in 1969, our printing methods and copying methods were very crude. And it
you
was
mean there wasn't a Staples on every other corner?
No, there was. There was a staple at the top of it of several bound pages. It wasn't even
I'm talking
a magazine.
The company, but go ahead.
Yeah, there wasn't any binding or anything on this. And I just was disappointed because it wasn't what I had sent over my $5 for. So Jim's name was in the front page, and I noticed that he lived in St. Paul. And guess what? I lived in Cottage Grove. It was a suburb of St. Paul. I took the time to write a letter, and it was a nasty letter. And it's funny because I'm 17 years old and I had no filter. I wrote that I received this piece of junk and written in crayon, and I'm embarrassed to even have it in my collection. And I basically reamed this guy. Okay?
Why am I not surprised?
But I wouldn't normally do that in today's world. That was a 17-year-old.
Yeah.
So a few weeks went by, and all of a sudden one night my phone rang. I did have a phone in my bedroom in those days that I paid for with my paper route money in those days again. So the phone rang, and the guy on the other end, he says, "Is George there?" "This is George." "George, this is Jim Melby." I remember I'm going, gulp.
Oh boy.
I mean, I had no idea who this guy was. I didn't know how old he was. I didn't know anything about him. And he said, "I'm calling about your letter that you sent me." And I was just kind of like, "Oh my God, I'm dead." Well, he explained to me that he had taken over this publication, and he was agreed to fulfill the subscriptions that had been paid. And he told me, he said, "I appreciate that you took the time to write to me, and that it probably isn't what you were expecting." And he said, "I'd be glad to give you back your $5. But he said to me, "I noticed that you live here in the Twin Cities." He said, "Do you go to the wrestling cards?" Well, now remember, about a year before this, I had obtained my driver's license, and I was going to wrestling on a regular basis. Jim says, "Well, I go to the matches too." And, for all I know, we could have bumped into one another and never known it. Well, come to find out, he was only 19 at the time, and I was 17. So we talked on the phone that night. Literally, it was over an hour. This brand new person I just met. We talked about how long we'd been a fan, found out that we'd followed wrestling the same number of years, that we collected programs, that we had some magazines at the time. And at that time, we had some 8x10 photos. That was our collection. And he says, "Well, we should get together," which a couple of months later, I had ended up in the hospital. I had pneumonia. Like 2 months later, I ended up in the hospital, and out of the blue, Jim Melby came up to the hospital and visited me, and he brought me a bag of about 5 or 6 back issues of Matt Mania that I had not ever gotten. And he came up to the hospital. The fact that he took that plunge kind of cemented a friendship, and we were friends. Then we started going. Now, the long story short on this is Jim at 19 was already married, and his wife was expecting a baby. And Jim did not drive. He never had a driver's license in his life. And his wife wasn't going to be able to go to the matches because she was pregnant. And he asked me, he said, "Would you be interested driving? If you drove," he said, "I've got an extra ticket. It would be free," because he had ringside tickets. "And would you, if you do that, we can go." I started doing that. And then his wife stayed home when the baby was born. She stayed home with the baby. I'm going to the matches with Jim. So this was going on for, a year and a half, 2 years. And, but what we did now, to go back to your Fantasy Wrestling Alliance, Jim taught me that results were important. And I was originally upset with his wrestling results, but he taught me that results were important because it told us what wrestlers did in each territory. They won, they lost, they were pushed, they were wrestling openers. They could be in a main event in one town. They could be a different name. And that's what results were revealing. And so I was loving this. Well, then Jim and I came up with the idea that, we could create our own little, and this is just between him and I, we could create our own little wrestling alliance, and we could promote our own cards using our own wrestlers and make our own angles and the whole thing. So Jim had his little spiral notebook, and I had my little spiral notebook. And he says, "All right, he's going to promote in Hawaii. He's going to be the Hawaii promoter, and I'm going to be the California promoter." And we decided we would have mutual Pacific Coast Tag Team Champions and mutual Pacific Coast Tag Team Champions. But each of us would have a Hawaii champion or a California champion. But when we wanted to change the titles of that Pacific Coast title, we would consult one another. Is it okay if we put the title on so-and-so? And then we'd work it into our promotion. And we worked it where Jim would say, well, I'm not going to use this guy anymore. So do you want to use him? And we were promoting fantasy wrestling. And it was all made up, but we used real wrestlers, no made up wrestlers, real wrestlers. And we created our own feuds, our own matches, our own angles. And it just became a hobby. And we continued to do it up until the day that Jim passed away in 2007. I continued to do it even then. And every once in a while, when I'm just sitting by myself and something boring is on television, I'll take out my promotion book and I'll work a couple of cards, couple angles, and but it's all fantasy. And just so everybody knows, I do now have 175 spiral books of made up matches. And it's a little promotion within itself. So there you go.
All right. So obviously we covered some territories, and I will get to AWA stuff that I didn't cover. But I was thinking about it today, and there are, and I actually just released this episode with a talent from the early 2000s, from the indie scene and stuff, and Matt was there in the background for that, in April Hunter. And I used the line of promoters will be promoters. And that hasn't changed throughout the years. And I know George would get what I'm saying with that. But my question with that is, because you would notice, I think, the one promoter I always heard that was actually a man of his word, that if he told somebody something, whether it be another promoter, a talent, etc., was Vince Sr. in my area of the WWF. That if he mentioned something to you, all right, I'm going to bring, like say a talent, I'm going to bring you in 6 months, a year, whatever it is. He stood with what he told you. Was there any wrestler or promoter across the board like that? Because Vince, that I can think of in this study, in the history and all, Vince Sr.'s name always came up. Was there other people like that, whether they were a wrestler or, and as I say that, wrestler-wise, I always think of Harley Race, where if Harley told you something, you knew his word was good. Can you think of anybody that was promoter or talent that was good on their word?
You know, the thing about all of the wrestlers, and you have to remember that when we're talking the 50s, 60s, 70s into the 80s, so, you know, about a 25-year period, there were, back in those days, we know that there were 25 to 30 different individual territories.
But the thing is, your word was your bond. That's why I'm asking.
Well, that's what I'm going with. That, you know, all these different territories. Yes, there were territories and there were unscrupulous promoters. There, you know, when you talk to wrestlers of the era, they will tell you, or they would have in their day, they would tell you that, you know, when I went to work for so and so, you know, the guy was a crook. You know, I didn't get paid, or he told me he was going to pay me this and I got that. And no, I didn't want to work for him. But there were the promoters that, generally speaking, yes, I always call him, you called him Vince Sr. I always refer to him as Daddy Vince.
Okay.
You know, before Junior. So if I do say Daddy Vince, that's what I'm referring to.
I know where you're going with that. Go ahead.
But he was in the 60s and the 70s generally considered to be, his word was his word, and he kept it. And if he told you were going to get paid this amount of money, you got paid that. If he told you he was going to do this particular push or angle with you, he followed through with it. But there were really some stellar promoters that deserved to have that same honor. And when I say this, it's because I got it from the guys themselves, the wrestlers themselves. A wrestler would tell you the territories they went to, and there were times when they stayed there for a while, but they realized that they weren't getting what they were promised. Go ahead.
I guess I should correct myself, George. And the other name that would fit that bill of being a person of his word, and correct me if I'm wrong, would have been, who was that in Dallas? He was
Before Fritz?
Not Fritz, or no, excuse me, Houston.
Houston, Paul Bosch.
Paul Bosch was the other name that I would hear, that if he told you something,
yeah,
he was usually good for his word.
As you were throwing out the Vince Sr. thing, I was thinking in my head real quick. Paul Bosch was one of those promoters. Don Owen in the Pacific Northwest. Owen, I have never heard, and he had one of the most vibrant territories. You know, any wrestler of any major name went through the Pacific Northwest in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and into the early 80s. And
that would be the three that I could think of that would be if they told you something.
Right. And then Vern Gagne, you know, every wrestler. Now let's stop right there and clarify something.
Okay.
If you start talking, if we start talking about the Vern Gagne from 1985 to the bitter end of the AWA in 1991, that is not the same Vern Gagne. It was a Gagne that was struggling for the battle of his life. His promotion had been raided and destroyed. Wrestlers had left him and walked out on him. Vern had there are some wrestlers that have said, well, he didn't pay this or didn't do that, but that was a whole different battle.
The money wasn't there. It wasn't the same structure, but go ahead.
But if you talk about the Vern Gagne of the 60s and the 70s and the very early 80s, every wrestler that I've ever talked to, that have ever talked, even guys that didn't like Vern, they always said Vern paid well, Vern had a good schedule to work for, and Vern always came through on his word. Okay? And one of the examples when I say even if they didn't like Vern, one of those guys would have been Larry Hennig. Larry and Vern didn't have a close relationship outside the ring. For whatever their reasons were, they didn't care for each other. And Larry carried it a little more than Vern did. Larry would never say anything good about Vern. But Larry told me, he said, Vern always took care of me money-wise. Vern always took care of me. Okay? So, but those promoters, you know, Sam Muchnick in St. Louis, another one.
He was,
And Eddie Graham in Florida, he had a reputation for being what you were told you were going to get.
I think of him for psychology-wise, but go ahead.
Well, when you look for psychology-wise, you got that opens up another door because.
Well, I'm just saying. I think when you say Eddie Graham, I think of how he structured things. But go ahead.
Eddie was one of those guys that ran a territory that was very tight. You know, Bobby Heenan. Let's jump to Bobby Heenan 1 second.
Oh.
Bobby Heenan made a comment one time when he was talking about paydays with promoters, and Bobby Heenan made the comment. He said, and he used Vern Gagne as his example. He said, Vern had heat with wrestlers, but Vern wanted you to work. He wanted you to be on time. He wanted you to come to the matches and be there for your match when you were scheduled. You know, he said, Vern asked you to do what you should be doing. Why would you be upset with him? And Vern promised you money. You got money. You got what he told you he was going to give you. So Bobby had those words to say about Vern, and Bobby was with Vern, almost off and on for close to 20 years. Close to 20 years. But
you know what? Go ahead.
Well, and I was going to say, when you mentioned the psychology thing, you got a guy like Eddie Graham who was first and foremost an outstanding worker in the business himself as a wrestler. He knew how to be a babyface of the best, and then he knew how to be a great heel. And he knew how to work a feud, work a program, tell a storyline. And his psychology was right up there with a guy like Vern Gagne. Vern did the same thing. Vern.
Yeah, I didn't think Vern would be a psychology guy, but
Well,
just because of different styles. But go ahead.
Different styles. But another one that you got to throw in there would be a guy like Ole Anderson.
Yeah,
Ole had a mind for the business. And Ole, you talk to 10 wrestlers and 9 of them hated Ole. Well,
shocker.
What you got to stop and realize, though, is that Ole ran one of the most prosperous territories during his era. And so another one that comes to mind is Bill Watts. Bill Watts, oh my God, he ran a promotion. He was a strict boss. He had he had a great mind for the business. And and the thing about Bill, and I use Bill, Ole, and Eddie in this example, and Vern too, they never asked any of their wrestlers to do anything that they themselves didn't do or wouldn't do. That's where I think they were great promoters.
Yes.
If Bill Watts set up an angle and he wanted a wrestler to do this, that, or the other thing, Bill Watts had done it himself over the years.
Exactly.
And he believed that that's what you do.
Yeah. And I know you're not a fan of him, but I would even say Vince Jr. was the same way. He wouldn't ask, and even though we may not all like and even though he was a visionary in certain ways, he wouldn't ask the talent to do things he wouldn't do. But,
I don't necessarily think your comment would be exactly true if you said I'm not a fan of Vince Jr. I never liked all the many things that he did in the 80s and the early 90s.
That's what I was saying you wouldn't be a fan of, the changes that he brought,
the things
cable TV, etc.
Right. The things that he did by, telling wrestlers not to appear on a card that he was scheduled on at a different promotion, or
like a Hogan,
or paying him to not appear on that card. Vince did things like going to TV stations and paying them to not air the local program that had been aired and put on his show instead. I mean, these were things that were new and devious tactics. But I have resolved over the years that bottom line, this was a business and it was going to change. And some of the old guard of promoters were unable to change with the times. And even when they tried to work together, they couldn't because they had their own individual egos and programs that they wanted to run. So sometimes Vince just watched them implode on their own.
Yes, and that is true in some sense. But what you're saying with the buying of the local TV and stuff, I just want to clarify for fans. So, because I know what you're saying with that, but just so folks know, let's say the AWA would pay for their local, because this was time of cable expansion and stuff, but I'll use the AWA Georgia's home territory for an example. Let's say Gagne would pay $3,500 for the month or whatever the case is for the shows to air on the local networks. At this time that we're talking about, Vince would come in and say, "Hey, I'll give you $6,000 for that same time slot and everything else." So that's kind of some of the stuff that people may not be a fan of. So, am I far off on that?
No, you're spot on. And it's one of those things where the TV station, they're only interested in revenue and people watching their show or their shows.
And if somebody's going to double their profit,
Right. And then, the other thing, I mean, Vince did this next thing too. And back then I thought it was very unscrupulous, but here's what a promotion would do. Vern Gagne, I told you he ran back in the 70s and the very early 80s. He was running a monthly card in the St. Paul Civic Center and Minneapolis Auditorium, whichever one was available. But here's what he had to do, and every promoter had to do this, Jonathan. They would go at the beginning of the year, they would go to the local arena and they would book out their dates that they wanted to have for their wrestling cards. Now you got to remember, a wrestling auditorium, an auditorium or an arena, they are there to host not just wrestling. They're there to host the ice capades, the circus, the what do you call it? The monster truck things they do, and and concerts. And so
that's how they made their money, the venue.
The arena is a calendar that's booked out for the year. So you'll get notice that George Strait, the country artist, is going to be here in September.
Love George.
He was great. So when Vern, just using his promotion, because every promoter had to do this, he would go and get his Civic Center or his Minneapolis Auditorium dates booked out a year ahead. They're on the calendar. Well, in the mid-'80s, when this whole territorial breakdown thing and the changing of the guard, so to speak, Vince was going into these arenas and paying them to not rent to Vern the St. Paul Civic Center or the Minneapolis Auditorium. And he would pay them more than it would cost that they would, So what's the objective? Now Vern doesn't have a place to host his card. Not only that, his television slot has been taken. So now he has no place to promote his wrestling. That was as dirty pool as you could play. But again, in the scheme of it all, it ended up being business as it was back in that era. And today, I'm over it. We moved on.
All right, let me ask you this, because I heard you talk about this when I was floating around. And you said something about you were talking about the NWA. And the NWA, when it was founded in 1948, was a unique setup. But you said it wasn't a territory per se, but it was a champion. So why do you say that? But also, who decided the boundaries of when they set up the NWA?
All right. The best way to describe this is that in 1948, when the group of promoters, and I don't have the list of all of the promoters that were at the very first meeting, but it was Sam Muchnick, Wally Carbo, Tony Stecker, Pinky George, Orville Brown was included in it. And, I think Cliff Gustafson, but there was just this huge room of promoters that had agreed to get together, and they wanted to vote on recognizing one world champion. Now, I think the best thing to say, first of all, is that back in 1948, the world was a lot smaller than it is right now. So you have this group of promoters that said, let's choose one guy, one wrestler. And all of these promoters in these other territories would agree to pay a due, they called them dues, to what was called the National Wrestling Alliance. They'd pay the dues, and then with those dues, they were promised dates for the guy chosen to be the champion, whoever that guy was. The idea being that each territory would get a chance to have the champion come into their territory once or twice a year, or maybe during a month work 3 or 4 of the towns, and the champion would come in. The concept was perfect, but it wasn't a promotion, because as I said, you had all these promoters from different territories that were the founding fathers, if you want to call them, of the National Wrestling Alliance. It was agreed in the beginning that Sam Muchnick would be the president, but then they would have their annual meetings. And the annual meeting simply amounted to the promoters all getting together, all of the member promoters, and they would sit around the table and they would discuss the pros and cons of so-and-so as champion. How is whoever it was at the time, and let's just use Lou Thez. Well, I don't want to use Lou. Let's go to Dick Hutton. Dick Hutton is champion in 1957 to 59. Now, when it was agreed that the title would be put on Dick Hutton, that was Lou Thez, who had agreed that he wanted to be relinquished of the title for a while. He wanted a break. He had been champion off and on for a number of years. He wanted a break. He said, I will lose the title, but I want to pick my opponent, the guy that I feel will represent the championship in a professional way. He chose Dick Hutton. Now, that name is going to be foreign to a lot of people because if you list all of the great NWA champions, Dick Hutton's kind of the forgotten guy in the pool. But he was champion for 2 years. So when they have these meetings, one of the things they're discussing is how the champion is drawing in all the various cities he's being sent to. Dick Hutton, or the NWA champion, did not work for a promotion. So he didn't work just for St. Louis, or he didn't work just for Florida, the Florida territory. He didn't work just for the Texas territories.
He would go to all these members per se.
He would have a schedule that was basically arranged by, let's just say, Sam Muchnick to make it easy.
Yes,
and Sam would send him out. Sam would give the champion a schedule. You know, this week you're in Portland, Oregon. Next week you're in St. Louis, Missouri. Then next week you're in Houston, Texas. Or the next night you're in Miami, Florida. And this is how it was. What started to be the problem. Now, go back to Hutton for a minute. Dick, the idea is the champion had to draw good money when he went into a territory. He had to be the reason the fans were coming to that card. The world champion is here, you know, and our local challenger, whether it be the babyface or the heel, has earned a title shot. And the champion wasn't in town every week. It was only once or twice or maybe 3 times a year. So when he came in, it was huge. They'd always have usually a big house. And if the NWA champion always had to be kind of a tweener, he had to be able to play a heel if he was against a babyface challenger. And if he was going against a heel in the territory, he had to kind of be the babyface because then the fans wouldn't want to see the heel beat the world champion. You know, they don't want this bully being the champ. So that's how it worked. Well, with Dick Hutton, the attendance was not up. Dick did not have a lot of charisma. He wasn't a very charismatic guy. He was a great wrestler, but he didn't have the ability to get fans to come out and see him. So after 2 years, they said, we got to get the title off of him. We've got to go with a different guy. So when they have their big annual meeting, they toss around names. Who are we going to put the title on? And every promoter had their own agenda. You know, I think Joe Schmo should have the title, and I think this guy should have a chance at the title. And, well, they'd all end up voting. And eventually it comes out who they feel as a consensus is going to be the best guy for the job.
Which is a political job in itself, but
it is. But it was still not a promotion. It was just a champion. And the champion would go to these individual. What happened, though, is when he'd go to Houston, well, Houston was an NWA promotion in the sense that they used the NWA champion. Therefore, it appeared they were NWA. But it was just a champion. It's just like in Minneapolis in the 50s, before the AWA ever came around, Minneapolis was under the NWA umbrella, but we were never announced as an NWA territory. We just got Lou Thez to come in once in a great moon and defend the title. And that's
well, how did that change when, because obviously this story, we talked about this, but like Vern Gagne wanted to throw his name in a hat, and this goes into the political side, that he felt he should have had a run at the NWA championship. Didn't happen. Him and his partner uh, founded the AWA. I believe it was in '60. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Oh, that's
And
correct.
things went on from there. So when did that? Uh, would they still have an occasional appearance? And this is before Harley became Harley. He was, I don't remember the year, was teaming with like a Larry Henning and such. Got his real start in the NWA.
Yeah.
So when they did that separation, was there a point that they didn't recognize the NWA at all, like what Vince did? Daddy Vince, at least.
Let's go back to, I used 19. I originally said 1957 that Lou wanted to give up the title for a while. Okay,
Yes.
let's first of all take whoever was the NWA champion, and let's stick with the 50s for a second.
Okay.
Whoever was the NWA champion, for the most part, it was Lou a lot. But we did have some stints in there with Whipper Billy Watson was champion. But Lou generally. But here was the deal. The concept of having one traveling world champion in 1948 was good on paper. But as the 50s moved on and in towards the 60s, you ended up having more territories. You ended up having more promoters. And you had a guy who was supposed to be in all of these cities. And it got to the point where the champion of the NWA, the champion was wrestling literally 365 days a year. Never got a chance to have a day off. And it wasn't that they were wrestling close to home. They were in Minneapolis. They were in Houston. They were in Portland. They were in California. They were in Atlanta. They were in Tampa. And they lived on an airplane. And so
when you say that, that's a good point. People don't realize travel in that time period wasn't the same that it is today.
Right. And let me point out that, yes, the champion did have air travel available to him, but even then, a lot of car travel in those days. But now let's go to 1955.
Okay.
It got to the point with the champion having so many cards to appear on and not having any time off that they realized, when you want to talk about when the NWA started to break a little bit, it was as early as 1955, only 6-7 years removed from the 48 one world champion concept. And what had happened is, in California, the promoter in San Francisco, I can never pronounce his name, was it Mickle?
Before Schire, right?
Yeah. They had come up with an idea that they were going to have Leo Namolini, who was a professional football player from the state of Minnesota. He was a great wrestler. And they were going to, along with the blessing of the NWA promoters, or Sam Muchnick at that time, they were going to have Lou Thez lose the title to Leo Namolini. But then what they did is they had the match. Leo won in San Francisco and some surrounding areas. Leo was wrestling as world champion, NWA world champion, but they never recognized it, Sam Muchnick and the so-called NWA themselves. So the problem is that for a while we had two NWA champions, but only one gets the recognition. And then Lou got upset. He wanted his title back and wanted full recognition. So they worked out their differences. You flash forward to 1957, when Lou Thez and Edouard Carpentier had a Chicago match in
Out
June.
of Montreal.
And they ended up where it got to be a goofy finish, and some promoters were recognizing Carpentier as champion. Lou was also defending the title, but it was done with the blessing of the NWA. Muchnick did not complain when Carpentier was filling some of those dates that obviously Lou Thez couldn't, because one man couldn't do it all.
Yeah.
So for a while, we had two champions again. But again, when they finally patched up their differences, Carpentier is no longer even getting acknowledged as NWA champion. But you try to tell that to the fans that went to these cards that Leo Namalini and Carpentier were on, and he wrestled as, was introduced as, and walked out of the ring as world champion. You try to tell them that they didn't see the NWA world champion. The NWA never gave either one of them recognition officially. So in the history of the title, neither name is mentioned. But as far as I'm concerned, they were NWA champions. Now you get into what happened with Carpentier. He was being controlled. I don't want to say controlled. His bookings, he was managed by Eddie Quinn out of Montreal.
Yes.
Promoter.
Before the Rougeau, this is before the Rougeaus, correct?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, definitely. Eddie Quinn was kind of the guy that took care of Carpentier, and he was negotiating to have Carpentier be champion, and Lou Thesz wasn't going to go for it, so they had their breakup and had the rematch and agreed to be friends and go their separate ways. But Omaha, for example, now when I say Omaha, Nebraska, you have to look at the whole state. Well, you have to look at, it wasn't AWA until later in the 60s, later in the early 60s. It wasn't right away at the beginning. It was not Omaha was not an AWA city. And that's another story in itself. But in 1957 and 58, Joe Dusick was recognizing Edward Carpentier as world champion after that dispute with Lou Thesz. So all of those fans in the Nebraska territory who saw Carpentier as world champion, how do you tell them they didn't see him? They did. They went to see the world champion. He was on their cards. Now, different title splits happen. Can you still hear me?
All right. So I was asking when we froze. You know, and some of the towns make sense, like a Chicago, a Milwaukee, a Winnipeg, etc. Makes sense for the territory as far as the map goes. But when did they expand to a Denver, a Vegas, and Omaha? When did that happen?
Omaha was in about 1962 or 3, where they moved in and basically it became Vern's promotion, along with Joe Dusick being the promoter. Denver, Colorado, Wyoming actually became a stop for them. And that happened in the 70s. And it was basically in some of those places where they hadn't had any regular wrestling to any degree. So Vern was able to go in and, get a local promoter to get a license and then supply the talent. And you go to Denver, it was Gene Reed who was the promoter of record. He had the promoter's license, but he would agree to use Vern's talent and become part of the AWA. So it became one of the regular stops on the schedule for Vern to go on a monthly basis or whatever to a place like Denver. Milwaukee came in, Green Bay, Milwaukee. They were in the 60s. I don't know I can't remember the exact dates, but in the mid 60s, they started to come around and they were part of the circuit. A lot of people think Chicago was part of the AWA in the 60s, but they were not part of the AWA until about 1965. Before that, it had been run by Fred Kohler. And Fred Kohler, in the early 60s, Fred Kohler was associated at times with Vince Sr.
And the DuPont network, right?
Well, that was even earlier yet. That would have been in the 50s when the DuPont or the Dumont network. I just about said DuPont. That's what Greg always says, DuPont. It's Dumont network. Sorry about that. But yeah, Vern would get the expansion, get a promoter, get a license, be able to go up and provide the wrestlers for that city. They became an AWA city. Winnipeg in the 60s, the very early 60s. Oh, I'm trying to think who ran Winnipeg. It wasn't associated with Vern. But mid 60s, he started working with Leroy Hirsch, or Al Tomko was his real name, Al Tomko. He wrestled as Leroy Hirsch at different times. But Al Tomko became the promoter of record in Winnipeg, and then he would use Vern's talent. So it became an AWA city. But Vern always had a territory where the guys could work maybe 3 or 4 nights a week and not every week. And so that goes back to what we were saying earlier when you talked about Vern being a good territory to work for or a good promoter. The wrestlers liked the schedule because they could work 3 or maybe 4 nights a week and then be home with their families those other 3 days. And in most territories, that was not the case. If you worked down in Florida, you had wrestling 7 nights a week. You were in Tampa one night, you were in Miami one night, you were in Palm Beach one night, you were in Tallahassee one night, you were in Fort Lauderdale one night, and Miami Beach. There was another part of that too, but
Jacksonville.
Jacksonville, yes. And like I said, they ran wrestling 7 nights a week in all the big cities in Florida. That was the Florida promotion. So these guys, even though they were maybe only wrestling in one state at the time, they were basically in their car every day traveling to the next town to wrestle that night. And you had 7 days of work. And to get a night off, it wasn't easy. So when you come up to a territory like Vern, where you can go to St. Paul and wrestle on Saturday night, maybe go to Milwaukee on Tuesday night, maybe have Thursday night or Friday night in Denver, well, hey, that's a piece of cake. The guys liked it. And the other thing was, when we were talking about paydays, Vern's territory paid a lot of these guys the same amount or more money than they were getting in some of these territories where they were traveling in cars 5, 6, 7 nights a week. That's what made it so great.
Absolutely. And the other thing is, and I was thinking about it, was especially when the changeover was happening and Vince was doing his thing, was in 84, the AWA still had a great year.
Yeah.
But now, mind you, some of the talent that were still there, your Hennings and your Verns and et cetera, were maybe in their 40s and 50s. But theoretically, they still had a great year, 84 going into 85. Why was that?
I can't speak for the other major cities of the AWA because I don't personally have attendance records or anything. But if you talk just Twin Cities, Minneapolis, St. Paul, in 1984, well, first of all, let's go that the raid started in December of 83. That's when Hogan said he wasn't coming back. And that's when the breakdown started. As we went through 1984, we had a lot of wrestlers that made their exit. Vince had taken them, promised them a better deal, promised them a contract, whatever it was. And 84, though, Vern continued to bring in top talent. He had a successful 84. He had a very successful 85. He even had a semi-successful 86. And then after that, it started to get a little bit tougher because now even Vern, he'd bring guys in and they wouldn't show up or they wouldn't come in. They wouldn't wrestle. And so the bottom line was this: in 84 and 85, whenever Vince would come into the Twin Cities with his cards, for those 2 years, Vern and Vince they were putting on cards sometimes one night after the other. And there were a few times when they actually held a card on the same night, which you think is that's terrible to think about that, because now you're giving the fans, they got to decide. But what the deal was is that during the time of 84 and 85, Vern was still out drawing attendance-wise, Vince in the Twin Cities. And if
Let me make it quick.
if I got out my attendance records, I can show you what Vince was drawing, and I could show you what Vern was drawing. Vern was still outdrawing him, even though some of the same talent that he used to have on his cards was now working for Vince. I mean, we had one card right before Hulk Hogan left. Hogan was in a major program with Dr. D. David Schultz. When Schultz left with Hogan, about 2 months later in the Metropolitan Sports Center here in Bloomington, Minnesota, that was Vince McMahon's main event, Hogan and Schultz. And fans, that was fresh in their mind. They'd just seen, 3-4 matches between them in the AWA just a couple of months earlier. So to a lot of average fans, Jonathan, that was very weird. They didn't understand. They didn't, the average fan didn't understand the promotional war or what was going on behind the scenes. But fans were being forced sometimes to go to both cards. And there were fans that did. They'd go to Vince's, they'd go to ours, but Vern still outdrew attendance-wise. And they were both drawing good numbers. I mean, I'm talking you'd have Vince draw 14,000 at his card, and you'd see Vern have 17,000. You got to think in a 2-day period or a 3-day period, having 2 wrestling cards, you've drawn close to 30,000 people. That's huge. So Vern was doing well, but eventually, with him unable to compete with the television, with the arena situation that we talked about a little earlier, with wrestlers coming in and then not showing up, it got to the point where Vern was out of business. And that happened, and it wasn't just Vern Gagne. That happened in all the other territories that Vince was raiding. When he went in and took their 3, 4, 5, 6 top guys, I think fans were just totally confused.
So the reason and I think about this, and obviously I would say, and correct me if I'm wrong, the top two things territory-wise would have been the AWA because they closed shop in 91, and Memphis. I think they went to maybe 93.
Memphis went a little bit longer.
Was the AWA open per se because of guys like, say, let's go, the Road Warriors came in. You had Medusa Michelli, the Midnight Rockers, Scott Hall, Rick Martel, guys like that. Because there was obviously in between what we're talking about is we had the Stan Hansen deal. But would it have been guys like the Road Warriors, et cetera, that I just mentioned that were able to help the AWA chug along to
when some of the guys that you mentioned, you had obviously the Road Warriors were one of the huge guys to come in after Hogan departed, and we had Bruiser Brody. We had him as King Kong Brody, but Bruiser Brody was in. We had, through the course of the years, we had the Mongolian Stomper. We had Masked Superstar. We had King Tonga, who later became Ming or Haku. He used both those names, Haku and Ming, but he was King Tonga in the AWA. We had just a ton of guys, like you say, the Rockers, the Fabulous Ones were here, Stan Kern and Steve Lane, or Steve Kern and Stan Lane. It's not often I get my tongue tangled up.
I know who you're talking about, though.
But these were all guys that were coming in, and Vern was able to continue, but it got tougher and tougher as we got into '86, and basically after the Hansen debacle, it started to go down even more, because by that time frame, Vern had lost so many of his television outlets. He was having trouble finding arenas that were going to rent to him. And it goes back to the way it was done by the WWF at the time, where they did this in other territories as well. They'd go in and they'd take, go to Bill Watts and take his Freebirds and his Junkyard Dog and his Hacksaw Duggan and Ted DiBiase and Paul Orndorff. Do you think all those guys were huge? And Vince took them. Well, here's Bill Watts trying to find replacements, trying to put the pieces together. And Bill had other problems. He was dealing with the oil crisis down there in the 80s. So there's all kinds of reasons, but to say that Vern Gagne hung on as long as he did, I always said that the AWA died in 1987, at the end of 87. But he was promoting some cards in small venues as far ahead as 1991, but drawing no people. When you go there and you got 300 people and you got to pay 10 guys on the card, well, guess what? You're losing money between your arena and your wrestlers and your travel, whatever it may have been. I mean, it just got to the point where Vern had to close up shop.
So, it's interesting you said that about the losing money and stuff, say after 87, George. And how many guys would you say? Because you and me have had this conversation about if the NWA and different folks, because there was the Pro Wrestling USA and such, have worked together, there would have been more of a fight against the WWE at the time. But how many guys do you think said, you know what, we made our money? Because a lot of the promoters were in their 50s and 60s. But how many folks said, you know what, we made our money, we're going to give up?
Most of them were even older than that. That was the sad part. Vern was already 60. And most of the promoters of that era, the Paul Bosches, the Don Owens, the Eddie Grahams, etc., they were all 60 something. And part of it was some of it is their blame. They could not agree to work together like they had intended with this Pro Wrestling USA. If they'd have all gotten together and used their wrestlers and become one promotion rather than 3 or 4 promotions attempting to be together and promote cards. And it got to the point where each promoter wanted to be in charge. And, I don't know about you, Jonathan, but any business I ever worked for during my working years, you can't have everybody be the boss.
Right.
It just doesn't work. You have to have a boss. You have to have one person or maybe 2 people that are going to call all the shots, run the company, run the organization. And when Pro Wrestling USA got together, they weren't able to all sit down and say, okay, Vern, you're going to be in charge. Or Jerry Jarrett, you're going to be in charge. Or whoever it was. They fought amongst themselves. They all wanted their wrestler to be in the main event. They wanted their wrestler to be on the card. And their objective was, we're not here to put ourselves over. We're here to come together to destroy Vince McMahon. And had 4 or 5 promotions come together and been able to do that. And I think they would have had a better chance at beating McMahon. I say that then, but I think if we all look at hindsight, which is always 20/20 vision, I look now and I say, I think Vince was going to win by hook or crook. In the end, he was going to have his hand raised as the winner. It may have taken him longer. People have said over the years, well, what would have happened if he wouldn't have had Hulk Hogan from the get-go? Hogan was his poster child. Mm-hmm. That was the first step in his national expansion plan, I needed to have the wrestler that I felt was the poster child for what I wanted to do going national. Hogan was that guy. Now, people say, well, okay, if Hogan wasn't available, I believe in hindsight that Vince would have still won, but it would have taken him a lot longer. Who would he have used in place of Hogan? Could he have used a Paul Orndorff? Could he have used a $1 Million Man? Could he have used Randy Savage? Or maybe, who knows what wrestler? Terry Von Erich? Who would have been the guy that? Yeah. And all of them, if you line them up and say, okay, who's better than Hogan? None of them are. Hogan was the man. But I really do believe he could have done it with one of those other guys. It just would have taken him longer. He could have even done it, I think, with Ric Flair at that point. But it would have taken him longer. Hogan made it easy. That was the piece of cake that made the whole thing work.
Because when you mentioned some of those names in the could have been of Kerry, that would have been a couple years down the line. And obviously that was post-accident. When you say Ted DiBiase, I think of him in that top run there. I can't see him as a babyface. I see him as that heel.
But remember, he was a babyface.
Yes, he was at one point.
He was the babyface he was a top babyface for Bill Watts.
He's done both for Bill.
Yes. Yeah.
So, but I think when I was growing up, mind you, I thought of him as the heel.
Yeah.
I was born in '84. The one name and here kicked around and comes to my mind, if Hogan wasn't the guy, would have been, and I know this sounds obvious with the hindsight, is Dusty Rhodes.
Dusty Rhodes' name has come up. It has. And the thing is, I don't disagree with that either, just like all those other names I just rattled off to you, because I think it would have taken a lot more patience and a lot more money, because Dusty could have maybe done it. However, it wouldn't have been as easy that it was with Hogan. Hogan just was in the right spot at the right time. Bottom line, Vern Gagne had built Hulkamania up. I mean, if Junior ever says he made Hulkamania, he's a lying sack, because he didn't. Vern did. Vern created Hulk Hogan that we knew, that became the poster child for WWF. Vince saw that.
Yeah.
And the other thing that people don't realize is that right before Hogan left the AWA, he left in December. And in October of that same year, we had Andre the Giant in for one of his annual visits for the Battle Royals around the AWA. And Hogan and Andre had been teaming together to go against 2-on-3. It would be them against Bobby Duncombe and Jesse Ventura and Blackjack Lanza or something like that. And it was...
Is that when they went to Japan?
They did. But here's what happened. Vern had set up an angle, and it was played on All-Star Wrestling, where during the Battle Royals that Hogan and Andre were in, they bumped into each other a few times in the Battle Royal, and it was a battle of the giants. And there was a little bit of pushy-shovey. And on one of their interviews on TV, they actually kind of had a little bit of in your face. So Vern had been setting up in his mind that I was going to end up having Hogan and Andre eventually wrestle. And Hogan went to Japan shortly after that. And then that never happened. Now, do you know what happened by 1987? What was the main event at WrestleMania 3? Hulk Hogan versus Andre the Giant. in the Pontiac Silverdome, and that was Vern Gagne's feud. That was his.
But
That
here,
was his.
I think it should also be mentioned as well. And I know the story you're talking about where they set it up in the Battle Royals and trying to start plant those seeds. But that also happened in Hogan's first run in New York for Vince Sr. But they also
Because they did wrestle. They did wrestle.
Yeah,
yes.
they did wrestle, and they wrestled. Hogan was the heel, Andre
Yeah.
was the baby. But they also wrestled in other territories, like for Bill Watts and the Superdome and things like that. So,
Yeah.
you know,
But see, the thing with Vince Sr., as great a promoter as he was, when Hogan was there, they had him managed by Freddie Blassie,
yes,
and they were using him as a heel, and Hogan was not getting over. And Vince didn't know how. Now, this is Daddy Vince again. He didn't know how to use Hogan at the time. Hogan had very limited microphone skills. Okay. And Greg Gagne has told this story, and it's a true story. Greg was on a card for Daddy Vince. Greg was on a card in Madison Square Garden, and he hooked up. He met Hulk Hogan, and Hogan was just kind of down in the dumps. Greg was talking to him. He said, "You know what's going on?" And he said, I'm not making it in the business. It's not happening for me." And Greg told Hogan, he said, "Call my dad," meaning Vern. He said, "Call my dad. We'll get you to come into the AWA." Now, people don't realize that Vern trained hundreds of wrestlers, actually physically trained them to get into the business. Well, he didn't train Hulk Hogan to get into the business, but he brought Hulk Hogan in, and he had the other wrestlers work with Hulk Hogan. Bobby Heenan, of all people, you wouldn't think this, but Bobby Heenan was working with Hulk Hogan on microphone skills, how to do an interview, how to deliver the interview. And Bobby Heenan was his enemy on the surface and, to the fans.
Oh, absolutely.
But behind the scenes. And Vern had wanted to make Hogan a heel. And he came out, and you could look this up. He brought in luscious Johnny Valiant to be Hulk Hogan's mouthpiece, because Hogan couldn't, I tell you, Hogan couldn't put a sentence together on an interview.
He would say this, Hogan
and
would
it's true.
this.
And he has said this. He couldn't put a sentence together. So they bring in loudmouth Johnny Valiant. And Johnny was great on the mic. He was good to listen to, but he was getting Hulk Hogan over. Bobby Heenan, along with Johnny Valiant, they're working with Hogan, get this interview skill. But the problem is that as much as Vern wanted Hogan to be a heel, this was a time when the fans decided.
Yeah.
They wouldn't boo him. They would put Hogan in a handicap match where Hogan would be against 2 and sometimes 3, and they were jobbers, to use that term at the time. But on the surface, it's 3 against 1. And the fans were cheering Hogan.
Yeah.
They wouldn't boo him. And short-lived as his heel turn or his heel run was, Vern got the light went on, and he said, "I can use this guy."
Based off the Rocky III and such, right?
And that was the deal too. Rocky III plummeted Hogan into the national limelight, which is another reason that Vince wanted him back later on, because he was a ready-made poster child.
Yeah. And the thing is, too, you mentioned Greg Gagne, and there's a story I always heard. And when we talked with Jim Brunzell, he would always talk about and you mentioned other guys would coach him and stuff. Those are the guys that would come up with the rip it in the t-shirt.
Yeah,
Brunzell on one side, Gagne the other. And, that story's been told.
Yeah. So Vern Gagne made Hulkamania. The movie Rocky, was it 3 or 2?
Rocky III.
Rocky III. Okay. And that movie also made wrestling fans out of people that weren't wrestling fans originally.
Yep.
One example was a neighbor I had at the time. He wasn't a wrestling fan, but he went to the Rocky movie with me and he was watching wrestling afterwards. So it was a crossover. And like I said, from the beginning, Hogan was blessed to be in the right place at the right time. And Vince recognized that, and the rest is history. And, here we are 41 years later, and we're still bashing it around. But it is the time that wrestling changed.
Yeah.
And then, we had guys like Bruiser Brody and Stan Hansen, who were every bit the big name that Hogan was at the time, but they couldn't be trusted. They couldn't, you couldn't saddle them down. You couldn't get them to keep their word to you. They were independent. They were going to do what they wanted, and they would lose to who they wanted, or they wouldn't lose because I'm not going to lose.
Yeah.
So those two guys, and then when Vern put the title on Stan, that's when the ship blew up, because it was the dumbest thing that Vern ever did. But he did it out of desperation. He needed and wanted a big, major name to go against what Hulk Hogan was doing in the WWF.
Yeah.
But
the thing was, Stan made most of his money in Japan.
Exactly.
So I can respect that.
Yeah. Well, that story too, again, here we are 40 years later. The relationship with Stan, it was done because Vern needed a major big name and a national reputation. Stan had that. So on that chord, it made sense for Vern to say, I'm going to put the title on this guy because he's going to draw. Perfect sense. But the other side of it was, Hansen was making a good portion, the majority of his money in Japan. He was huge over there, just like Hogan was, just like Brody was. And when Vern was going to put the title on Stan, this has been told before, Nick Bockwinkel and Jack Lanza, behind the scenes, both told Vern, don't do it, because it's not going to work. Hansen's not going to follow direction. Here was the thing about any promotion that ever put a title on any champion. The only guys that were going to get the title were guys that were going to take the orders. The guys that when you wanted them to lose, they were going to lose. When you wanted them to keep winning, they were going to win. And then the third ingredient, which helped, was they had to be able to defend themselves in the event that a certain wrestler wanted to try and pull a curve and a swerve in a match and try to see how tough he was. The champ had to be able to beat that guy. In that case, it could end up a shoot. And that's what he had.
And with the AWA, the two guys that would stand out, and I know people bash, they were always champion or they always were in the title mix. The two guys that stand them in that description that you would have is Vern Gagne, who had the amateur background, and he owned a company and all. Be that, and the other guy would be who had the amateur background and was a generational guy, was Nick Bockwinkel.
Yeah, and see, Nick was 100% where Nick always knew that he worked for Vern,
and he was always business.
And he always said, I do whatever Vern asks me, Vern pays me, Vern takes care of me. And I do what he asks. So if Vern wants me to drop the title, I drop the title.
Yeah.
And Stan Hansen wasn't that type of a guy.
No.
Well, now let's just talk, because I've done this before, and I think it's worth repeating. People say, well, Stan's allegiance was to Baba in Japan. And that's where he made the most of his money. And I'm with you. I agree that that Hansen made good money with him, and Stan would want to go over there and wrestle. But here's the deal. And to me, this seems so simple and logical, but I've known so many people that can't agree with it. When Vern put the title on Hansen, Vern was entitled to have Hansen as his employee,
Yeah.
do what was asked of him, wrestle certain dates, and if Vern decided he wanted him to lose the title, Hansen should lose the title. He's the employee. On the same note, if Hansen goes over to Japan and he works for Giant Baba, Baba is his boss, and Hansen does what Baba asks him to do.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is that Stan couldn't separate the difference. He didn't want to realize, and I'm going to stop right here and say one thing. I had the chance to meet Stan Hansen and talk with him long after he was champion. He's a nice guy.
Yeah.
I like him. He's quiet, he's calm. He kind of chuckles about the whole thing with Vern Gagne, but I just want to say that I'm not bashing Stan as a human because I think he's a nice man. Okay.
You're separating business from
right. So
person.
The deal is that Stan was going to Japan on a regular basis. And even though Vern knew this in advance, this was a desperation move to put the title on a national name. This was, other than Bruiser Brody at the time or Stan Hansen, Vern didn't have anybody else he could go to that would have the star power that Hogan had. Not saying that even Stan or Brody were in the same elite group as Hogan, but they were as close.
But you're not telling me nothing. Yeah, I'm aware of this.
So when Stan was getting harder to deal with, and he was going to Japan for one of his 8-week tours, Vern had went to him in Denver. Vern had made the decision, I've had enough. I'm going to put the title back on Nick, and we're going to just let Stan go to Japan. And if Vern did anything wrong, it was that he didn't tell Stan before the card that this was going to happen. Because he told him the night of, right before the match. Now, I will give Stan a break here and say that as the employee and the work he was going to be doing, it probably would have been kind of Vern to say a week or two or a month before that when you go to Denver on this night, you're going to drop the title. I would go along with that. But bottom line was Vern was still the boss. So on the night of the match, we're 2 hours, an hour and a half before Nick and Hansen are supposed to get in the ring. Nick was informed that he was going to go over Hansen. They go into the shower, the three of them, and the shower was their meeting place when they were in the locker room. That's when they
That's where the business was handled.
That's where they handled
not just there, but across the board.
They're not there to take a shower. So he got in there and he basically told Stan that you're going to drop the title tonight to Nick. Now, Hansen was getting on a plane in the morning and heading to Japan. And Hansen just said, what the hell? No way. You're out of your mind. This ain't going to happen. I'm going over there. I'm advertised as AWA champion. That ain't going to happen. And Vern said, no, wait a minute. It's my belt. It's my title. They got in each other's face. And Nick told me this story personally because Nick was in this meeting. And he says they got in their face. They started to push each other. And Hansen grabbed the belt, beelined out of the arena, out of the shower, the locker room, in the arena. And Vern, now this was a sudden turn of events that Vern hadn't prepared for. What is he going to do? He goes out and announces to his audience, his crowd, that Stan Hansen has refused to wrestle Nick Bockwinkel, which was true. And by forfeit, Nick Bockwinkel is the new world champion. Now, all of the armchair quarterbacks right away say, well, Vern should have had a tournament. He should have had an elimination match. Shoulda. Okay, whatever. But Vern had to make a gut decision on a spur of the moment. And that's what happened.
Yeah. So
And Stan was gone. And then Vern sent him a note, or a letter, and asked him for his title belt back. And Vern did have to contact an attorney to get his title. Excuse me. And when then the fun story is that when Stan sent it back, he drove over it with his pickup truck first. Had this big wheel track through it. So that's funny. And Stan laughed about that. He said, later on, he said, it got out of hand. We shouldn't have. Now, here's the irony of it. What American fans did not know. And again, kayfabe is still alive, okay? Stan went over to Japan for his tour, and he wrestled over there as AWA World Champion. He had the belt when he went to the ring. So for all practical purposes, those fans in Japan saw the AWA champion. At least that's what they were at the arena for, and what they saw. It was sort of similar in a roundabout kind of way to what we talked about with Carpentier and Lou Thez.
Yep.
Stan wasn't the champion, but to them he was. And he still got to go, and Stan still got his way. He got to go over and wrestle and get the big money to wrestle in Japan as the AWA World Champion.
George, we've done another 2-hour run here. So we've covered a lot of ground here. So as we put a bow on things, how would you wrap with what we talked about? What are your thoughts? Because we were all over the place, obviously. How would you put a bow on things? Because there's stuff I didn't even touch on again, but we went around the horn. How would you put a bow on tonight's discussion?
I would say that you and I have had another one of the great discussions where if we were able to do this around at a table and coffee or beer or whatever, it would be fun. We'd enjoy it, and we could do it again.
I think we can.
There is no end to wrestling conversation, and the little tidbits that fit in, off the subject. It's like when you're taking a road trip. You're going across country on a road trip. Every once in a while, you're going to take a detour and go to some off-scale place for a few minutes or whatever. You do that because it's all part of the story, and that's what. And
as we put a bow on this, and you're absolutely right. Can you mention the Facebook group and the everything else like that as well, and the books?
Well, obviously, if you're interested in the AWA, I would say get my Minnesota's Golden Age of Wrestling. It's Minnesota because it was published by the Minnesota Historical Society, and they wanted Minnesota in the name, but it's an AWA history and a lot of profiles on wrestlers of the era back in the book. So it's available. You can order it at your local Barnes & Noble. They'll get it. Here in the cities, I still see it on the shelves at Barnes & Noble because it's local. But you can order it through Barnes & Noble or go to Amazon, easiest way. And to be fair with you, Amazon's got the best price. And even when you buy it from Amazon, I still get a little, what do you call it? A little royalty.
Royalty.
At the end of the year. But Amazon, Minnesota's Golden Age of Wrestling. I do have 3 AWA record books that are available on Amazon as well. And they cover the 60s and the 70s. So if you're interested in results and some trivia information included and some photos, check those out. My wrestling Facebook page is George Shire's Wrestling Time Machine. And make sure when you put in George Shire's, you put the C in my last name. A lot of people forget it. And if you don't do that, you're not going to come up with it. So George Shire's Wrestling Time Machine. Click the join button. And if you're interested in wrestling history pre-1990, I only go up to 1990. And if you're interested in that stuff, we got programs, clippings, photos, trivia, stories, and just a lot of fun. So hit the join button and we'll make you a member.
Yes, and I'll put links to everything there. George, thank you again for tonight.
I have fun doing